What if 17 individuals never really left and were allowed to perish in chains? What led to the tragic conclusion of a restoration project? For what reason do residents continue to hear murmurs beneath the ground? And what mysteries are hidden within the deteriorating walls of a Georgian plantation that has been forgotten? This goes beyond folklore. Lockage is what this is. Furthermore, not all shackles were intended to be broken. If you're interested in following true stories that defy time and uncover secrets, to ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right away and enable notifications. In rural Georgia, there is a section of road where the trees are so closely spaced and twisted that their branches rise aloft like skeletal arms in a state of perpetual tension. A strange quiet, a silence that appears to push against the ears, is frequently reported by passing travelers. The remnants of the Lockage plantation can be found here, just past an unmarked fork in the road. Most people think it's merely a farmhouse in ruins, engulfed by plants and the unrelenting humidity of the South. However, it is a site with a past so terrible that it has hardly survived the light of documentation, according to those who know or have dared to inquire. Built in the early 19th century, Lockage was never one of Georgia's opulent farms. Despite its small look, it was vast in land and kept well out of the public eye. Elias Lockage, its owner, lacked both social grace and political presence. He was a trader of labor, dealing in the bodies that harvested crops rather than in crops themselves. Although there are few records of his transactions, surviving auction sheets contain names, ages, and alarmingly frequent notations: isolated, chained, and non-compliant. There was a Georgia clay-carved room beneath the main home, which could only be reached by a secret stone stairs behind the cellar wall. This was no ordinary workroom or detention cell. This prison had a low roof, no windows, and was moist from the agony of pain. In this place, considering the oral testimony that was given, 17 enslaved people were shackled to the walls, not as a form of punishment, but rather as a result of their abandonment, as reported by local families and supported by some records that were found. Elias Lockage ran away in 1863 as Union soldiers advanced across the state, and rumors of emancipation became more prevalent. He just brought a handgun, cash, and ledgers that he could carry. He didn't let the prisoners go. He never came back. Only those 17 individuals remained, chained to stone, trapped underground, in the midst of quiet and darkness. No water, no food, no mercy. The Lockage family's descendants did not breach the cellar wall until 1891, some 30 years after the Civil War ended, in an effort to appraise the destroyed land for inheritance purposes. What they discovered was more than just unsettling. It was hideous. The room was now a graveyard. Still in chains, bone fragments and corroded iron fused with skeletal remnants were bolted into the walls. The dirt beneath the bodies was charred as if burnt, and the air was sour with rot. Oddly, neither animals nor time had disturbed any of the bodies. No insects, no rodents. The chains were spotless, having been polished by an invisible power. One report was filed by the sheriff's office, but it subsequently vanished from the county records. After the location was cleared, the family relocated to Savannah without touching the estate. It was cursed ground, they said. Since then, the area has become the subject of local legend, which includes tales of animals that become silent when passing the overgrown fields, youngsters who hear chains in their dreams, and weird lights in the woods. What was discovered, however, is hardly the most disturbing detail. That's what was left. The chains remain in place, undisturbed, as though they are waiting, as though the object that was chained there never really gone. The Lockage plantation. Myth didn't come up again in serious form until 1947. While investigating Wilkes County properties from the Civil War, a local historian called Edgar Mallory found a family Bible at an antique auction in Savannah. There, amid the fragile pages, was a name he had never heard of: Samuel put on his clothes. Short, cryptic remarks, many of which were hardly readable, were scrawled in the margins. However, within the rear cover, bound with a decomposing leather, a tiny ledger was a tie. The pages were fragile and discolored. Although the ink faded, it was still readable. It was a diary, a painstaking, terrifying record kept by the final supervisor of the plantation. There was no owner for Samuel Dress. Elias Lockridge used him as a brutal enforcer and weapon to keep the slave population under control. He writes in a methodical, emotionless, and mechanical manner. The names are seldom employed. Rather, each item consists of a series of sanctions, behavior corrections, and containment strategy comments. What came out of these papers was a picture of a guy who saw only obedience, or the absence of it, and no people. The spring of 1862 marks the start of the most unsettling entries. The phrase, "they're dressed," is used repeatedly to describe a group of 17 people who are kept apart from the others. He refers to them as the dissenters. He records their detention in what he refers to as lower confinement, which corresponds to the chamber's measurements discovered decades later. Deprivation of food, sleep, and light is noted in the entries. Eraser starts off silent, but gradually the tone starts to change. One line says, "No communication, no acknowledgement." Dress's entries become unpredictable at the end of summer. Dates are omitted. The penmanship becomes less legible. He starts out by describing sounds and murmurs in the stone, still clinking chains. He writes on September 12th, "They have stopped speaking to me, but I hear them every night. They are in the walls now." The last few lines are almost indiscernible, but one line is highlighted 3 times in heavy charcoal, as though it were scratched with escalating urgency. "They will remember me. They don't sleep." The ledger then comes to a close. Samuel is not known to have worn clothing beyond November 1862. Only his remarks and the implied suggestion that he might never have left the estate. No burial, no death certificate. Intrigued and worried, Edgar Mallory tried to find the Lockridge family's descendants. Margaret Lockridge, an elderly woman living in seclusion in upstate New York, was the only one he could find. She reportedly went pale and remained silent for the remainder of the session when he asked her about the plantation. Mallory's notes indicate that her parting remarks to, "If you found the ledger, you've already heard them too." Mallory wrote a brief article about his findings in a small regional journal before calling it a day. Although most people ignored the article, others started looking for the Lockridge estate in the years that followed. Many historians, sensation seekers, and paranormal aficionados returned with intriguing tales. Some never came back at all, and the last page of the ledger has yet to be explained. Below the maddening scroll, there's a childish illustration. With their eyes wide open and their arms bound, 17 figures stood in a row. Their cheeks are covered with ink, as though a tear or a drop of water had fallen on them. Some people think the ledger is just the result of a damaged mind coming apart due to guilt. Others claim that the confession is meant to warn rather than to appease. Because those 17 never perished if what Dress said is accurate, not at all. The Lockridge estate was more legend than fact by the early 1970s. Most contemporary maps lacked the overgrown acreage, and the surviving buildings, partially engulfed by moss and time, stood silently against erosion. However, rumors persisted in neighboring towns. Reports of voices that weren't, those of the living, of footsteps in the fields at night, and of figures seen through trees. For the most, it was only Southern legend that was handed down from bars to gas station clerks as the evening wore on. Too much time. But it was the ideal research topic for a group of Atlanta University students. As part of a summer field study, the team, led by Charles Wexley, an archaeology student, planned to investigate sites from the Civil War era that had been forgotten. They brought tape recorders, notebooks, and an unyielding faith that the legends were just that, legends. After weeks of searching through land titles at the county archive and speaking with older residents, the group discovered the Lockage estate. The plantation appeared to be dead when they got there. It had hollow windows. The rotted floors bowed, but there was a strange feeling in the air. The team camped out beside the main house on their first night, and Wexley would later write, "The silence was not natural. It was watching us." One of the girls, Linda Carr, reported hearing a low, repetitive humming sound beneath her tent that evening as dusk seeped into the trees. It sounded like someone was whispering a lullaby from far below the surface. No one slept the second night, but the others laughed it off. Sounds inexplicable were captured on recordings made close to the ancient cellar. Breathless chanting, the faint but distinct clink of shackles, and the drag of metal against stone. They entered the chamber after breaking through the cellar wall on the third day. They discovered exactly what Maller had described decades earlier. The stains, the quiet, and 17 iron rings set into the clay walls. However, there was more. The stone was etched with symbols, rough stains that appeared to be designs. Sarah Elkins, a student, observed that the marks bore similarities to West African Adinkra symbols, particularly those associated with mourning, remembering, and seeking revenge. However, these engravings were not created in captivity. They were new. Panic took hold that evening. Believing that her name had been uttered just into her ear, Carr woke up yelling. Wexley's hands trembled violently. Normally calm, Elkins spent hours standing in the field and gazing into the woods. They ran out the next morning, leaving behind documents and equipment. Their findings would never be published by Wexley. His secret audio journal, which was later found in a storage unit after his death, provides the only narrative. His voice, heavy with terror, is hardly discernible in the last entry. "I believed them to be ghosts. They're not. They remember, and they're awake." Within 2 years, 3 of the 6 students who attended Lockage experienced nervous breakdowns. In 1978, one vanished while hiking in the area once more. Her remains were never found. According to locals, the forest doesn't return favors. Dozens of amateur investigators have tried to find the chamber in the decades thereafter. Most discover nothing except decaying ruins. Some have recorded strange EVP recordings, in strange dialects, with bursts of static interspersed, with mechanical moans, but everyone who sets foot on the ground returns feeling as though they are being watched from below, and 17 is usually the number. 17 knocks, 17 shadows, 17 sets of dark eyes. The Lockage plantation reappeared in the spring of 2006, but this time, it was not as a whispered rumor or a piece of folklore, a private development. With the goal of restoring the estate as a living museum of antebellum architecture, the company Asher Heritage Holdings purchased the grounds at a silent auction. With investors imagining guided tours, historical reenactments, and even overnight stays in restored slave quarters, it was an attempt to take advantage of the expanding heritage tourism business. None of them foresaw, or perhaps choose to overlook, the land's resistance to disturbance. Clearing the site was the first step in the rehabilitation process. They chopped down trees. Scaffolds were used for the remaining constructions. But strangeness increased as soon as the labor began. Unidentified equipment malfunctioned. Tools disappeared and were later discovered buried in the ground. Employees experienced unusual rhythmic hammering from within the walls, murmurs that stopped when lights were switched on and freezing places on hot summer days. Many people disregarded it as superstition up until the chamber's opening. The team found the barricaded entrance to the underground cell beneath the main home using plans taken from the state archive. They anticipated discovering little more than a dilapidated cellar when they broke through the wall. Rather, they discovered the room was remarkably intact and had not been touched since the 1970s. All 17 of the iron shackles were still in place. Samples of soil showed something unsettling. Human tissue remnants embedded in the clay, together with heat signs, but there was no discernible source of heat. The etchings were even more unsettling. Deep grooves that were only scratches decades ago have become larger and more intentional, as though something had been chiseling from the stone itself. The site's structural engineer described the symbols as biological deterioration rather than erosion. A word in English was scratched on one wall using what looked like fingernails. "They can still see, so don't open." Days after, employees started to depart, out of dread, not out of protest, after waking up in the middle of the night with burn-like marks on his wrists, exactly where shackles would have been placed. One foreman, Richard Hale, resigned. Jorge Alvarez, another, claimed to be being pulled through the floor and was admitted to the hospital. He was severely dehydrated and would not go back. Catatonic muttering is noted in his discharge papers, 17-17-17. Asher Heritage persisted in moving forward in spite of these occurrences. That choice turned out to be disastrous. 2 crew members were discovered deceased within the chamber. On July 18th, it appeared that both had killed themselves, one by hanging, the other by exsanguination. The tools employed were unknown to the authorities. The messages each left behind were much more disturbing. "We woke them. We're not supposed to see," the first one said. Asher Heritage dissolved the project due to mounting pressure and internal turmoil, and the land was once again abandoned. The second, more cryptic statement simply stated, "They want to be remembered, not displayed." Public outcry was swift, and protesters, spiritual leaders, and descendants of enslaved communities demanded that the project be shut down. Paranormal investigators referred to the site as a spiritual crime scene. This time it is encircled by rudimentary handcrafted signs cautioning trespassers to avoid the area for their own safety as well as legal reasons. No authorized work has been attempted since, but odd things still happen. Hikers claim to be losing time in the vicinity, trail cameras record shapes where none should be, and locals claim to hear the sound of chains clinking in the wind, even though there is no metal left above ground. In 2018, a drone survey team may have produced the most disturbing report when they used thermal imaging to map the area and took a picture that left analysts perplexed. 17 different heat signatures standing in a perfect line just beneath the earth, still watching. Today, the Lock Ridge plantation is still guarded by rusting gates and barbed wire, hardly visible from the broken rural road that runs close to its edge. Although the land is technically private, no one has claimed responsibility for its maintenance in more than 10 years. Bankruptcies, lawsuits, and corporate dissolutions have clouded the legal ownership of Lockage, but the silence surrounding it is louder than any litigation, the silence of fear, of avoidance, of something deeper than legend. Locals no longer discuss it directly. Instead, they sidestep the topic or give vague warnings such as, "Don't walk that way." After dark, the few who live nearby report strange disturbances, such as animals refusing to cross certain fence lines, birds avoiding the airspace over the plantation, and pets growling at empty corners. On multiple occasions, 911 has received calls from children who claim to see people standing in the field, only to have first responders discover nothing but wind-rippled grass. The footage, which was later leaked online, showed deteriorated images of the chamber, now nearly entirely covered in mud and vines. But one shot taken just before their camera cut to static revealed a chilling detail. 17 pairs, human-sized, as if someone or something had recently been standing there. In 2021, a small documentary team broke into the site illegally in an attempt to make a short film on forgotten slave sites in the American South. Still, the entire video was never broadcast. Later, in an interview, one of the producers said, "It wasn't simply haunted. It didn't want us there because it was inhabited. There is still disagreement within the scholarly community. Some contend that the phenomena are psychological, involving mass suggestion, fear-induced hallucinations, and trauma ingrained in the terrain. Others propose something much less reasonable, namely that the suffering that, and what of the 17? No names were ever formally recorded, no graves were ever discovered, and no one came to claim them. The number is consistent across all accounts, from the dress ledger to the student recordings, from the restoration team to contemporary intruders. Chamber carved more than just scars into the stone. It carved a presence, a permanence, and a spiritual residue that remembers injustice with greater clarity than the living. Consistent. 17. Never more, never less. Always watching, always waiting. Some people think the spirits stay alive because they want to exact revenge, but others whisper that it's duty rather than retaliation, that these souls were bound by something more than just chains, a curse, a ritual, a binding act that sealed them in death and in purpose. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the drag of metal, the silence of breathless voices, and the soft, unmistakable sound of 17 chains tightening ever so slightly because the past is never truly buried. Not here, not at Lockage. No one who visits Lockage leaves unaffected. Some return shaken, others refuse to speak of it ever again, and some disappear completely. Occasionally, when the night is still and the moonlight cuts through the mist like a blade, someone walking past the old fence line might hear it.